Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 7, the Patriarchal Period. It says in verse 21 of chapter 25, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Now, we aren't told how she made inquiry. We aren't told about priests or anything else like that. But she is able to consult God, and God tells her there are twins, and the younger is going to be superior to the older. 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Notice that this took place before the children are born. God decides that the younger is going to be superior to the older. And this is what happens. Jacob liked to be around the house, and it says that Rebekah favored Jacob. Esau, on the other hand, was a man of the field, and he liked to hunt wild game, and Isaac favored Esau. When Isaac became old and his eyesight was failing, he wanted to bless his son Esau. So he called him and told him to go out and hunt game and fix it the way he liked, and then he would bless him. Rebekah heard this, and she sets Jacob up to take the place of Esau. She prepares a couple of lambs the way that Isaac likes his meal. She puts the skin of the lamb on Jacob so that his neck would feel hairy like his brother Esau. And then Jacob pretends to be Esau. He goes into his father, and he is able to deceive him. Isaac blesses him. And then as soon as he has gone, Esau comes in and prepares a meal and goes to his father. But he finds out that he has been replaced, and there is no blessing left that is positive for Esau. So he is very disturbed, and he cries, and then he determines that as soon as his father dies, he's going to kill Jacob, and that will take care of the situation. Well, Rebekah learns of this too. And so she sets it up so that Jacob will go back to her home out of danger until Esau has changed his mind. And so she mentions about the wives that Esau had married. They were local women. They were Hittite women. In chapter 27 and verse 46, Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living." And so she suggests that Jacob go away back to her home and get a wife from there, one of the daughters of Laban. Before this, we also had that Jacob took from Esau the birthright. Esau had been out in the field, and he had become famished. He was afraid he was going to die of starvation, and Jacob was cooking some porridge, and he came in and he sold his birthright to Jacob for that pot of beans. And then he was able to steal the blessing from him as well. So all of this was in the heart of Esau, and he was willing to kill Jacob. Well, Jacob is sent to Paddan Aram with the blessing of Isaac. It says that Esau, in chapter 28, verse 6, Esau learned that Isaac had blessed Jacob and had sent him to Paddan Aram to take a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he commanded him, do not marry a Canaanite woman, and that Jacob had obeyed his father and mother and had gone on to Paddan Aram. So he realized he needed to take another wife. So this is going to be wife number 3. And he married Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth, daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, in addition to the wives he already had. Now, as Jacob is going to Paddan Aram, he stops at Bethel. And at Bethel he has an experience with the Lord where he has a dream. There is a ladder ascending to heaven and angels going up and down on that ladder. He recognizes that this is the house of God. And so he names the place Bethel. Beth means house, El means God. And so this is the house of God. He sets up a stone there and anoints it. Then he continues on his way to Paddan Aram. When he arrives at the place where the family of Abraham had been, he sees a couple of shepherds and asks them about Laban. And they say, yes, he's there. And his daughter, Rachel, is coming with the sheep. Well, when she came with her sheep, Jacob took it upon himself to move the large stone that was over the well and watered her sheep. And then he told Rachel who he was, and he kissed her, and she went home and told Laban, her father, and Jacob then stayed with them. And it says that as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him, kissed him, brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, you are my own flesh and blood. Well, after he had been there for a month, then Laban suggested, you shouldn't work for nothing. Name your wages. And so we have then a contract between Laban and Jacob. Jacob loves Rachel and he wants to marry her. And he says, I will work 7 years for Rachel. And it says that it went very quickly because of his love for Rachel. And when the time came, instead of Rachel, he was given Leah, the older daughter, who wasn't quite as attractive as Rachel. And he questions Laban about this. And Laban says, well, I failed to tell you that the custom here was that we always marry the older daughter before we marry the younger daughter. And so he says, you can work another 7 years and then you will get Rachel. And so the week for the marriage to Leah takes place, and then the next week, Rachel is given to Jacob. And then he works for the 7 years to pay off this debt. And then we have a problem, because once you have 2 wives, you always have conflict. And when God saw that Leah was not loved, she was allowed to conceive. And she ends up bearing 6 children to Jacob. When Rachel sees that she's not having children, she does what Sarah had done earlier with Hagar, and she gave her handmaiden to Jacob to have children by her. She had 2 children. And then when Leah sees that she wasn't having any more children, she gives her handmaid to Jacob, and she has 2 children. And then later, Leah has a couple of more. So total of 6 in all. And then Rachel finally has a son, and this is Joseph. She named him Joseph, meaning may he add. In other words, I would like to have another child in addition to this. So we have 11 sons that are born to Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. And it's about this time that Jacob decides he would like to go home. Now we are also told that Laban kept changing his wages. And we're started out at first that every speckled or spotted lamb or goat would be Jacob's. Laban took all of those and put them in charge of his sons that we now hear about. He probably did not have any sons when Jacob originally arrived in Paddan Aram, but now he has sons, and these speckled, spotted animals are put in their hands, and they are moved 3 days distance from Jacob. So he has nothing to start with. And then we see that Jacob took limbs and peeled the limbs, and so that you have dark and light areas on the limbs. And he puts these in front of the animals when they are mating at the water trough. And the offspring then are the type that Jacob wants. We once had a psychologist that came from the University of North Carolina to Huntington College, where I was teaching. And I asked him about this. What Jacob has done here, does it really work? And he says, we don't know what the power is of the thought processes, even in animals. And so it may have worked, but I would like to say that God is the one who caused it to happen. Well, Jacob decides that he's going to go home. He doesn't tell his father-in-law that this is what he's going to do. He tells his 2 wives that they're going to set out, and they do this in secret. Rachel steals the household gods of Laban. When Laban finds out that Jacob has left, he pursues him. And it takes him a number of days before he is able to catch up. And Jacob then is in the area of Gilead, which is north and east of Israel. When Laban came, he was unable to find anything that Jacob's family had stolen. Rachel had taken the gods and put them into her saddle bag and was sitting on it when Laban came into her tent, and she asked to be excused from rising because she said that she was going through her period and she couldn't rise. So the gods were not found. And then there is an agreement that is made between Laban and Jacob. It finally ends with them setting up a pillar to mark the spot, and Laban would not go past that pillar to attack Jacob, and Jacob would not go past that pillar to attack Laban. And so Laban then is able to bless his children and goes back home. Now Jacob has another problem. What about Esau? Remember, Esau was going to kill him when his father died? Well, his father isn't dead yet. But he is going to have to meet Esau. And so he sends word to Esau that he is coming home. And Esau comes to meet him with 400 armed men. Jacob feels that he's finished. And so what he does is to divide his group into 4 parts. You have the children of Zilpah and Bilhah. They are put first in two separate groups. And then the children of Leah, and then Joseph and Rachel are in the last part. So in case Esau attacks and kills the others, perhaps Rachel and her son will escape. Well, as it turns out, Esau has no intention of doing any of this. In fact, he didn't even want to receive all of the animals that Jacob had sent ahead of him as a peace offering to him, because he says, I have enough. And then Esau goes back home, and Jacob continues then with the intention, it seems, of going to where Esau lives, but he stops in the eastern part of Israel near Shechem. And this is where he has another problem. His daughter, and she's the only daughter that is mentioned, has gone to visit the women of Shechem, and she is seen by the young man, Shechem, son of Hamor, and he rapes Dinah. And then he wants to marry her. But the brothers of Dinah are not intending to allow this to happen. They say, first of all, it'll be okay if all of your men are circumcised. So everyone is circumcised. And then while they are still in agony from the operation, then Levi and Simeon go in and kill all of the men in Shechem. They take the women and the animals, all of the loot, and destroy everything in Shechem. Well, then Jacob is afraid that they may be attacked by other inhabitants in the area, but God provides shelter for him. So after that happens, Jacob returns to Bethel. It says in chapter 35, God said to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." That is when he had the vision of the ladder going up to heaven. And so he went to Bethel and built an altar there, and he worshiped God. And then we are told in verse 8 that Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside Bethel. So it was named Alon Bachut, and that has to do with the oak of weeping. And then we see that in verse 16 of chapter 35, they moved on from Bethel. While they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." And she breathed her last, for she was dying. She named him Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, but Jacob changed the name to Ben-Yamin, which is son of my right hand. In verse 27 of chapter 35, Jacob came home to his father Isaac in Mamre near Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. Isaac lived 180 years. Now, we're not sure exactly how old he was when he blessed Jacob instead of Esau, but we know that Isaac was about 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born, and they were 40 years old, so he would be about 100 years old probably when he was going to bless Esau. And so now he's 180 years, and he breathed his last and died. gathered to his people full of years. His sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So if Esau was going to wait until his father died, that would be about another 80 years. And all of this transpired during that time. Now we need to continue on with the family of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we will be getting to Joseph, who is the one who carries on the line. But first we take care of Esau. We give his descendants first, get him out of the way, and then we return to the true descendant of Abraham. And the descendants are given in chapter 36. And then we go back to Jacob in chapter 37. And chapter 37 is all about Joseph. Joseph was a young man of 17, tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and sons of Zilpah. And they were doing wrong. Joseph told this to his father, and of course his brothers then hated him. But then Joseph has a dream. He has a dream that he's in the field and the sheaves are all there, and his sheaf stood up, and the other 11 sheaves all bowed down to him. And of course he couldn't wait to tell this to his brothers. And when he did that, they hated him even more. And then he had another dream. And that dream was that the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to him. If the first dream wasn't enough, this one really caused them to hate him. Even his father gets involved in this and asks, will he and his mother actually bow down to him? Well, as it turns out, yes, they do. God has ordered all of this through Joseph so that he can save the family in the time of need. Now, when Jacob called his son Joseph and told him to go find out how the sheep were doing, that he was to go to Shechem, and Joseph said he would do this. And so he started out from his place in the land of Canaan. And in verse 12 it says his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. So he went to Shechem. He didn't find his brothers. He was wandering around in the fields, and a man found him and said that the brothers had said they were going on to Dothan. And so Joseph goes on to find his brothers. They see him coming, and they determine to kill him. It is Reuben who stops them from doing this. He suggests that they throw him into a pit. There's no water in the pit, it's a cistern. And Reuben determines to come back later and free him and send him back to his father. But while they are eating their lunch, there is a caravan that comes through, and it's a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So Judah suggests, instead of killing their brother, let's sell him as a slave. And so he was sold into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. This would give each of them 2 shekels then. It says that when Reuben returned to the cistern, he was really disturbed. He didn't know what to do. And he says, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? And then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and took it back and showed it to their father and asked, identify this. Whose is it? So they gave him the impression that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Meanwhile, we're told that Joseph was taken to Egypt by this caravan, and then he was sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, as often happens when you're telling a story, if you can delay the story some, it adds to the story. So in chapter 36, we have a different story entirely, and this is a story of Judah. When this actually happened, it's hard to tell. The chronology doesn't seem to work out properly. But Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. When Judah saw a woman there, the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua, he married her, and she became pregnant, gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son, and he was named Onan. And then she gave birth to a third son, and she named him Shelah. Well, then the sons grow up, and Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. And then with the levirate marriage that was practiced, if a man died without children, then his wife was to marry his brother, and that son born to her would be the legitimate offspring of the dead brother. Onan didn't want to do this. He wanted all of the inheritance for himself, so God put him to death. So and Onan are both out of the way, and Shelah is the one left. But Judah is afraid that the same thing might happen to Shelah, so he doesn't give him to Tamar. But after the wife of Judah dies, he is on his way with his friend to shear some sheep, and he meets Tamar. She has learned that he is passing that way. She disguises herself as a harlot and sits by the road. Judah has relations with her, and when she is pregnant, she is brought out, and they are going to kill her. But she sends the staff and the signet ring of Judah to him, saying, I am pregnant because of the man who owns these. You notice that this is what happens when the coat of Joseph is shown to Jacob. See what this is. Well, she is doing the same thing to Judah and saying, see these, whose are they? And so he admits that she is more righteous than he is. And so she is allowed to live, and she gives birth to 2 sons. These sons then become very prominent in the family of Judah. Then the text goes back to Joseph in chapter 39. Joseph was sold to Potiphar. He was given charge of everything in the household because of his faithfulness and his trustworthiness. But Potiphar had a wife who noticed that Joseph was very handsome, and she wanted to have sexual relations with him and tried on several occasions to do this, and he refused. But finally she caught him in the house by himself and again appealed to him. But he ran out of the house and left his coat behind. She took the coat and kept it until Potiphar came home. And then she told him that Joseph had tried to attack her. And so Joseph is put into prison, into the prison that Potiphar was probably responsible for. It's interesting that at this point, Cyrus Gordon, my major professor at Brandeis, made the comment that Joseph was put into prison to protect him from the wife of Potiphar. Well, in prison, Joseph gains the same reputation that he had in the house of Potiphar. He is put in charge of everything. And there are two prisoners then that are added to the prison. One is the cupbearer of Pharaoh, and the other is the baker. After a time, they both have a dream. They are disturbed by this, but Joseph told them that they could have their dream explained by God. So they tell him the dream. The cupbearer tells about 3 baskets on his head, and that there were grapes in the basket, and that he put the cup in the hand of Pharaoh. And so Joseph says, this means after 3 days, you're going to be raised up to your former position. Well, when the baker heard this, he told Joseph his dream. There were 3 baskets on his head, but there were birds eating the contents. And he's told by Joseph that in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head from you. And so he is executed. And this sets the scene then for the dream that Pharaoh has. Joseph had asked the cupbearer to say something to Pharaoh because he didn't deserve to be in prison. But the cupbearer forgot all about this. Well, when the Pharaoh had his dream, and he has 2 different dreams. One is where you have 7 very good cows beside the river, and then 7 horrible looking cows come up. They eat the good cows, and they're still as horrid as they were before. And then he has a dream of 7 grains of wheat, and it's very nice. And then 7 grains of horrible looking wheat come up. They eat the good grain, and they are no better off than they were before. Nobody could give him the interpretation. So Joseph is summoned. When the cupbearer mentions him to Pharaoh, he tells the Pharaoh what is going to happen. That there will be 7 years of great plenty, and then there will be 7 years of famine. And this is sure because God has given Pharaoh 2 dreams. And then he tells Pharaoh what to do. Save up all of this grain in the good years so that you will have it available when the famine comes. Well, Pharaoh realizes that Joseph is a very smart person. There is nobody that can do it better than he can. And so he is appointed second in command to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. So he sets about gaining all of the grain that he can in the years when there is plenty. And then comes the famine, and he is the one who is responsible for distributing the grain to the people of Egypt. As it goes, he first takes all of their money to buy grain, and then he takes their animals in exchange for grain, and then they are made servants of Pharaoh in exchange for grain. So that as a result of what Joseph does, Pharaoh owns everybody in Egypt. And they are going to have to give 20% of their crops to Pharaoh every year as a result. Now we also have to bring into our purview here the family of Jacob. Jacob also has famine. He learns that there is food in Egypt, and so he sends his 10 sons to Egypt to buy grain. They come to Joseph. Joseph immediately recognizes them, but he tells them that they have come to spy out the land. The first visit is in chapter 42. What finally transpires is in verse 18, on the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your younger brother to me." And so this is going to cause a problem. So Simeon is left there in prison. The rest of them go home, and they tell their father what has transpired. Well, when they have used the grain, they need to get more, so they need to go back. But the brothers say, "We can't go back unless Benjamin goes back with us." So finally, Jacob allows them to take Benjamin. And the second visit then is in chapters 43 and 44. And Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in Genesis 45. Joseph is of the opinion that everything that has happened was set there by God. He was an instrument in God's hand to save his family. So he does not think of retaliation against his brothers at all. But they are concerned with this, and they are very guilty and recognize this and are afraid that Joseph is going to punish them. The story is that Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and then he sends them home with carts to bring the family down to Egypt. And so all of the family, about 75 of them, move from Canaan to Egypt in the delta area of the eastern delta, and this is the best farmland. The brothers, when they are presented to Pharaoh, say that they have been shepherds all their life, and that's what they do now. And so he gives them this area in the delta, and also suggests to Joseph, if one of the brothers is good at taking care of sheep or of animals, that he should be put in charge of Pharaoh's animals as well. Jacob is able to see his son Joseph, whom he did not believe was still alive, but now he recognizes that he is. He then also adopts the two sons of Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They are adopted as Jacob's own sons and have just as much right as the other sons of Jacob. Then Jacob blesses his sons in chapter 48 and 49, and he actually tells what they are like. That this doesn't seem like a blessing that we normally would think of, but in each case, he tells what is going to happen to each of the sons. And the one that is really blessed is Joseph. In chapter 49, verse 22, Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. And then in verse 25, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty, this is the El Shaddai again, who blesses you with blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. So Joseph really becomes the physical heir, even though Judah becomes the spiritual heir of Jacob. And then we have the death and burial of Jacob in chapter 49, verses 28 through chapter 50, verse 14. He is taken back to Canaan and buried in the field of Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah and Leah are all buried. And then Joseph himself reassures his brothers that he does not intend anything evil against them. And Joseph makes them promise that they are going to take his bones out of Egypt back to Canaan when they leave Egypt.